Today we're starting Unit 8. So this unit will be focusing on the Civil Rights Unit. It's a shorter unit, so we'll only have 4 sets of notes, and we will have a combined unit test with Unit 7. So Civil Rights Beginnings. So even though we're focusing on the more modern day civil rights movement during the 1950s and 60s, we can really trace back the civil rights movement to after Reconstruction. This is after the Civil War. So in the late 1800s, legalized racism returned to the South in the form of segregation. So segregation meant that there were areas designated for white Americans and areas designated for black Americans. And this could be in a movie theater, on a train, restaurants, different seating sections. It could also mean that some people weren't even allowed to shop or to dine or to enter specific businesses. And so people at that time, even back then, felt that that wasn't fair, that people should be segregated and forced into different areas. And so there was a court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. And so this happened in 1896. And so Plessy versus Ferguson was trying to challenge the idea of segregation, saying it was not fair. But at the time, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities did not violate the 14th Amendment. So even though black Americans had to sit in a different part of, had to do with trains, a different part of the train, they paid the same amount. The fact that they were still able to use the train, it was separate but equal. They were still being able to use the transportation, get to point A to point B. And so because of this ruling, segregation would exist in the U.S. throughout the early 1900s. So it's a way for you to see just how people's ideas and perspectives have changed. Where in 1896, the idea of segregation was deemed acceptable. So in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was formed by W.E.B. Du Bois, and its goal was to improve the legal rights of African Americans and bring an end to racial violence. So it's an organization, it's still around today, and its focus is, just like in its name, the advancement of the African American people. And so they did this through a variety of ways, so some of them bringing about court cases, trying to challenge laws, create new educational job opportunities there. Changes in the court. Thurgood Marshall was an NAACP lawyer trying to attack the concept of separate but equal in the court. So now we're in the 1950s. So again, people's perspectives have changed, your ideas, we've kind of evolved as people, and we no longer accept that separate but equal should be okay. And so they're trying to change that. So when you're challenging these laws in courts, trying to force the courts to change the laws. So in 1951, the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, was brought to trial to challenge segregation in schools. So in some areas of the U.S., schools were segregated. So you had all white schools, all black schools, and depending on your race, you had to attend your own school. There was no changing of that. There was no integration. So at the time with this case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the lower courts, like county courts, state courts, upheld the practice of segregation, saying that's fine, it's the way things have always been done, it's separate but it's equal, everyone's going to school. So that allowed them to continue to challenge this case to the Supreme Court. So in this picture, Thurgood Marshall is in the center with some other lawyers that was helping with the case, and they are in front of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. So a little bit of background about Brown versus the Board of Education. This is Linda Brown, so she is the girl in which the case is named after. And so what we'll notice with a lot of these court cases is that yes, you have a name, yes, you have a specific person that's the case is revolving around, but it's meant to represent all of the people that are going through this. So Linda Brown was a little girl in Kansas, and so she lived closer to the all-white school, but had to attend the all-black school, for which she then had to walk, 2 miles. She had to cross train tracks where she should have just been able to go to the school that was closest to her home. So that was kind of the test case with this trial. And so with the map, you also get an idea of how, during the 1950s, segregation was instituted in the U.S. In the red area, segregation was required. So that means by law, schools in those red states had to be segregated. In the yellow states, there was no segregation either way in terms of if segregation was allowed. In the blue states, it was optional, so probably depending on the city, the county, what the people there wanted, segregation could happen, but didn't necessarily have to happen. And then in the green states, segregation was forbidden, so a little bit more progressive. Schools were integrated in those regions. So you kind of had a mix of the public and how different states responded to the idea of segregation. So the Brown decision. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren issued the Supreme Court's decision. All 9 justices agreed that separate schools for African Americans and whites violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection under the law. They believe that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So the fact that you are forcing people to go to different areas, these different educational facilities are not going to always have the same funding. So they are having a different experience. They're not having an equal experience. This decision overturned the earlier decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. And so this is one thing that's great about our country, is that you can have these decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that said, sure, segregation is great. But then in 1954, we can realize that, you know what? That shouldn't have happened. We now realize the error of our ways, and that treating people this way is unfair, so we need to change it. So it allows for those changes to happen. Another little fact, so Chief Justice Earl Warren, that is who Warren High School is named after. He was, I believe, governor of California before he became Chief Justice. As Chief Justice, not only was he head of this Brown decision, groundbreaking decision, but also when President Kennedy gets assassinated, he is in charge of the Warren Commission that investigates the assassination. So he's very kind of not popular during this time period, but he has a lot of impact in a lot of different areas during this era of history. So the Little Rock crisis. So in 1954, when the Brown decision was made, 21 states had schools segregated by law. So now, with the Brown decision, that is illegal. So it's now made unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court did not offer any guidance about how or when desegregation should occur. So some schools or states kind of saw the decision, chose to change it on their own. Some people, though, in some areas just felt like, you know what, unless someone's going to force me to change what we're doing, we're not going to. So in 1957, the governor of Arkansas violated a federal order to integrate Little Rock Central High School. So now the government, it's been 3 years, are telling states you have to integrate, you have to make changes. But the governor's saying, nope, I'm not going to do it. My schools are going to stay segregated. So he ordered the National Guard. National Guard is the state military, to keep out 9 African American students who were planning on attending school. These 9 African American students became known as the Little Rock Nine. So they were chosen to be the first ones to integrate Little Rock Central High School. So everyone else in that school was white, and they were going to be the only black students there. So here's a picture of the Little Rock Nine. If you count all of the people, there's one extra. So she is, I believe, a local like NAACP representative that was just pictured with them. So these are all, they ranged in ages from, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade students. And those were the Little Rock Nine that were chosen to integrate Little Rock High School, Central High School in Little Rock. So the crisis continues. On September 4th, 1957, a crowd of angry whites harassed the black students as they arrived for school. So you have crowds from the town that are coming there to protest. They want to see that this integration of the high school does not happen. The National Guard is there but makes no attempts to protect the students. You can see them in the background of this picture with their helmets. So for 3 weeks, this continues. Every day the kids go to school, they try to go to school, enter the school, but they're kept out by the protesters and the National Guard. And so while all this is happening, this is also being videotaped. During this era of the 1950s and television, this is broadcast across the nation, so people are seeing this drama unfold. And they're not necessarily liking the fact that you have these high school age kids being treated this way. So it puts a lot of pressure on the president to step in and solve the crisis. So integration at Central High School. President Eisenhower tried to persuade the governor to back down, but the governor refused. Finally, on September 24th, Ike Eisenhower, he went on national television to announce that he was sending in federal troops to end the standoff. So federal troops would supersede the National Guard, the state troops. The next day, the students entered the school for the first time, this time guarded by federal troops. However, even though they're now able to go to the school, it doesn't mean that the harassment, the discrimination, or that the prejudice just disappeared. They still endured great abuse throughout the school year, but continued to go to school to kind of make a point. The following year, more African American students were enrolled, and so during the civil rights movement, you see people having to endure, being brave, not just for themselves, but for the movement and for what it means for everybody else. So here's a picture of the kids finally being able to enter the high school. You can see that they're surrounded by troops. They're guarded going in. And it's almost baffling that this had to happen just so 9 African American students can go to high school. So just kind of putting that into perspective of going to school today and like how much effort they went just to go there and that they weren't being allowed and being able to go to school, well, yeah, it might not be always fun, but it is a privilege and that not everyone had that privilege. So you should always take advantage of school, learn, maximize yourself. So we're done with the notes today for 8.1. Make sure you go back and watch 8.2 and also finish your key terms.